Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Husain Haqqani, Director for South and Central Asia here at the Hudson Institute. Welcome. Today we are discussing Bangladesh, which is not necessarily discussed a lot in Washington, D.C. Bangladesh is one of Asia's success stories on the economic front, with annual growth rates around 7% in GDP, standing at US dollars $249 billion, the size of GDP, and the country is one of the leading garment exporting countries in the world. On the political and social fronts, however, the country has been facing numerous challenges. There has been one party and leader that has been in power for almost 10 years, and some people are fearful that democracy is being hurt to provide stability. Others would argue that the stability and democracy go hand in hand. Bangladeshi society has also undergone tremendous transformation, and what is visible is the rise of the influence of some Islamist groups and their supporters. One such group is the Jamaat-E-Islami Bangladesh that has close ties with its allied Islamist groups in the region and beyond, including supporters in the United States who several scholars feel may pose a challenge to security in the United States homeland. Bangladesh is scheduled to have its next parliamentary elections on December 30th, and the outcome of those elections will be important not only for Bangladeshis, but for the South Asian region and beyond. We are grateful to our partners from the Middle East Forum for their help in putting together today's event. I will now introduce our panelists, but before that, I would like to welcome and introduce Congressman Jim Banks. Since January 2017, Congressman Banks has represented Indiana's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He currently serves on the House Armed Services, Veterans Affairs, Education, and Workforce Committees. The Congressman served in the U.S. Navy Reserve and took leave of absence from the Indiana State Senate in 2014 and 2015 to deploy to Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom and also during Operation Freedom Sentinel. Congressman Banks introduced House Resolution 1156 last month, expressing concern about the threat posed to democracy and the democratic process by theocratic groups operating in Bangladesh. Welcome to the podium, Congressman Banks.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to discuss the ongoing political crisis in Bangladesh. And thank you also to the Hudson Institute for hosting an event on this important topic. I appreciate the opportunity to be joined today on the stage by Ambassador Haqqani, Seth Oldmixon, Sam Westrop, and Abha Shanker. Bangladesh is a booming democratic country in the South Asia region with a growing presence on the global stage. However, Islamist groups like Jamaat-E-Islami threaten the country's prosperity. Bangladesh is a majority Muslim country that has an overwhelmingly positive view of the United States. According to a recent Pew Opinion survey, 76% of those in Bangladesh have a positive view of the U.S. But Bangladesh is a young democracy that struggles with radical groups attempting to subvert Bangladesh's progress, all while seeking political power for themselves. These violent, theocratic groups have committed violent acts against minority Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, and Ahmadi Muslims in an attempt to silence their voices and discourage their participation in the democratic process. Just days ago, 2 campaign workers were killed and dozens were injured as tensions rise before the December 30th elections. Other political actors see this group as a threat as well. Earlier this year, the president of the Gono Forum stated that his party will not join the Bangladesh Nationalist Party if Jamaat-E-Islami remains part of it. The United States should support the efforts of the government of Bangladesh to combat these radical Islamist groups and to reaffirm the rights of religious minorities. That's why I recently introduced a bipartisan resolution to call on USAID and the U.S. State Department to refrain from any partnerships or funding arrangements from any organization affiliated with radical Islamic groups in Bangladesh. In just a few weeks, the world will be watching Bangladesh's upcoming election on December 30th. Previous elections have been the breeding ground for violence by radical groups who have committed hundreds of acts of violence against religious minorities, minority-owned businesses, and houses of worship. Bangladesh also shares critical strategic partnerships with the United States. In July 2017, U.S. and Bangladesh leaders dedicated a multi-purpose training facility for the Bangladesh Institute of Peace Support Operations Training, a $3.6 million facility to train peacekeepers deploying with the United Nations. Bangladesh is also one of the largest contributors of military personnel to UN missions and plays a vital role in security cooperation. As we keep the upcoming election in mind, the United States stands with the people seeking free, fair, and safe democratic elections and religious freedom. So that's why I thank all of you for attending today's discussion. This is an important topic and deserves much more attention in Washington than what it's getting. So with that, I will now hand over the discussion to our expert panel. Thank you. Have a great day.
Well, with those remarks, let's just turn to the panel. My fellow panelists today are Abha Shanker. She is Senior Intelligence Analyst, Investigative Project on Terrorism, a non-profit research group in Washington, D.C. that investigates the operations, funding, activities, and front groups of terrorist and extremist groups in the United States and around the world. She has close to 15 years' experience in the fields of intelligence and counterterrorism. Sam Westrop, to her right, not necessarily politically, has headed Islamist Watch since March 2017, when the Middle East Forum absorbed the counter-extremism unit of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, where he was previously the research director. His writings have appeared in several publications such as National Review, National Post, The Hill, and the United Arab Emirates' newspaper, The National. And last but not least is Seth Oldmixon, who is the founder of Liberty South Asia, an independent, privately funded campaign dedicated to supporting religious freedom and political pluralism in South Asia. A former Peace Corps volunteer in Bangladesh, Seth's analysis has been featured on MSNBC and in The Hill, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, The Diplomat, The Cipher Brief, and Scroll.in. Let us begin our conversation today, Seth, by setting the stage for what's happening in Bangladesh, like a big picture. The political actors, the non-political actors, our discussion is stability, democracy, and Islamism. What do you see as the sources of stability and instability in Bangladesh? And what do you see the struggle between democracy and extremist Islamism in Bangladesh?
Thank you very much. This is actually a very interesting time in Bangladeshi politics. In fact, Bangladeshi politics is always interesting. But this year, with these elections, there are some new developments that inject a lot of unknown variables into it. But I want to start by just sort of laying the foundation, giving an environmental scan, who the players are. A lot of you in here probably are familiar with the parties. Some of you may not be, and I believe the event's being live streamed, so there may be more people who aren't familiar with a lot of the names. Starting at the top of the political pyramid, there are really two main political parties. The Awami League, which actually predates Bangladesh's independence and was instrumental in Bangladesh achieving its independence from Pakistan in 1971. And then there is the other major political party, which is the major political party in opposition right now, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. And the Bangladesh Nationalist Party was founded a few years later, actually right after the first military coup. The first military dictator, General Ziaur Rahman, as military dictators do, sought to hold on to power, but to do so in a way that transitioned to legitimacy. So in order to do that, he had to get some electoral support. Also, as military dictators tend to be, he lacked a natural constituency. So he reached out to the one group that had not already been absorbed into the new politics of the new country, and that was Jamaat-E-Islami and the Islamists more generally. So he edited, by fiat, the Constitution of Bangladesh and removed secularism as a founding principle, replacing it with trust in Almighty Allah. That was sort of the beginning. Now, if you fast forward to a bit, the relationship between the Bangladesh Nationalist Party and Jamaat-E-Islami became much more enmeshed. The reasons for this, again, and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party is very open about this, are strategic electorally. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party does not have as wide an electoral base as the Awami League. So they can make up for a lot of that by having an alliance with Jamaat-E-Islami. In fact, Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP officials will very readily tell you, we do not have an ideological alliance with them. This is purely for electoral purposes. The BNP may have felt that they could sort of control this Islamist group. But in fact, what we've seen is that, as often happens with radical groups, the menace sort of got out of control. So today, what's become very interesting is there's been the introduction, but it's really a reintroduction of an old political player, and that's a man named Kamal Hussein. Kamal Hussein is a former Awami League minister who left the party in the 1990s, and he's come back. Kamal Hussein is very well respected. He's very well respected as a secular Democrat, small d. And when he came back this year with the Gano Forum and the Oikya Front is the alliance that he's put together, he said, we want to form an alliance with the BNP in opposition to the Awami League, who's presently governing. But there's one strict condition, and that condition is Jamaat-E-Islami and other radical Islamist groups cannot be a part of this alliance. Unfortunately, that hasn't quite worked out. So a lot of us had a lot of cautious optimism that maybe we were seeing a new chapter in Bangladesh's politics. In the past couple of weeks, what we've seen instead is that the BNP gave 25 nominations to Jamaat-E-Islami leadership. Kamal Hussein's group, Oikya Front, unfortunately only got, I believe, 17 or 19. So Jamaat-E-Islami still plays this outsized influence in Bangladeshi politics. One of the things we're going to talk here more about is Jamaat-E-Islami's role here in the United States and outside Bangladesh. And I think it's important as we get into this conversation, we talk more about this, to define a little bit, talk a little bit, and although this may seem counterintuitive, but what Jamaat-E-Islami is not. Jamaat-E-Islami is not, as some of its lobbyists have characterized in the past, a conservative Islamic political party in Bangladesh. In fact, Jamaat-E-Islami is not a Bangladeshi organization at all, any more than Coca-Cola is a Bangladeshi company because you can buy Coca-Cola in Bangladesh. Jamaat-E-Islami is a transnational group in South Asia. It's often referred to as the Muslim Brotherhood of South Asia. And the reason that there's a lot of confusion about this, especially in Washington, is that Jamaat-E-Islami has invested a lot in lobbying in Washington to fill in this space where people are unfamiliar with their own definitions. In fact, just this morning I was going through some government filings and noticed that they have hired another lobby firm here in Washington.
Jamaat-E-Islami Bangladesh has.
Yes,
okay.
Jamaat-E-Islami. And the according to their contract with the lobby firm, the scope of work requires the firm to ensure that United States government policies do not shift in any manner contrary to the interests of Jamaat-E-Islami, nor create an environment where Jamaat-E-Islami is defined as a security threat within Bangladesh or on an international scale. Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about what it is that Jamaat-E-Islami is. So Jamaat-E-Islami was founded in 1941 in India by the fundamentalist Islamist philosopher Abdul Allah Maududi. And it has chapters across South Asia and, in fact, all across the world. So what do they believe? What do they want? If you ask their lobbyists, they'll tell you one thing, but I prefer to go to primary sources. Let's ask Jamaat-E-Islami what they want. So what did Maulana Maududi say? He laid clear the objective of his organization when he said in 1939, and this is the quote, "The truth is that Islam is not the name of a religion, nor is Muslim the title of a nation. In reality, Islam is a revolutionary ideology and program which seeks to alter the social order of the whole world and rebuild it in conformity with its own tenets and ideals." Maududi went on to explain that Islam wishes to destroy all states and governments anywhere on the face of the earth which are opposed to the ideology and program of Islam, regardless of the country or the nation which rules it. Now, suffice it to say, I know and have known a lot of Muslims. In college, well, I'm not Muslim myself, but I've studied, I've taken Islamic studies classes. What Maulana Maududi describes does not reflect any Muslims I know. It does reflect some people whom I've met over the course of my work, who are members of Jamaat-E-Islami, though. So this is what Jamaat-E-Islami believed and what they wanted 77 years ago. But what about now, right? So in 2005, a Jamaat-E-Islami leader in Bangladesh named Mir Qasim Ali gave a speech to a gathering of Islami Chhatra Shibir. That's the name of the student wing. Think of it as like college Democrats, but for Islamists. During this address, he predicted, with tears in his eyes, the establishment of a new Islamic caliphate and called on Chhatra Shibir members to be frontline soldiers in bringing about the end of what he called heathen Western civilization. Now this video, this speech is available actually on YouTube, and I want to actually say thanks to Islami Chhatra Shibir for posting it and even subtitling it in English, making it very easy to find. But the point is that Jamaat-E-Islami's goal of forcibly transforming the world to meet their vision of a so-called Islamic state continues. In fact, it was echoed again in 2016 by the head of Jamaat-E-Islami's branch in Pakistan. While saying funeral prayers for the terrorist convicted of assassinating Punjab Governor Salman Taseer, Jamaat-E-Islami's Siraj al-Haq prayed for Allah to grant Jamaat-E-Islami the power to enforce Sharia across the globe and declared that he and his supporters were prepared to sacrifice their lives to that end. Now, Jamaat-E-Islami's penchant for violence was perhaps exhibited best during the 1971 War of Liberation of Bangladesh. But this is by no means the only example. In fact, in 2013, before the elections in Bangladesh, Hindus in Bangladesh were targeted in a wave of violent attacks that vandalized their temples, burned their homes, and destroyed their shops. According to Amnesty International researchers on the ground, survivors told them that the attacks had been organized and carried out by Jamaat-E-Islami and its youth wing, Chhatra Shibir. The State Department's 2013 report on international religious freedom for Bangladesh noted that, according to the main domestic human rights organization, Aino Salish Kendra, 278 homes, 495 statues and monasteries and temples were destroyed, 208 businesses were destroyed, 188 persons were injured, and at least one person was killed, and that international press, human rights organizations, and the Hindu community leaders all laid this at the feet of Chhatra Shibir and Jamaat-E-Islami. Hundreds of Jamaat-E-Islami attacks against Bangladesh's religious minorities have shaken the country to its core in recent years, in what observers have called a coordinated campaign by Islamist extremists to destroy the country's democracy and cleanse it of religious minorities, including Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, and Ahmadiyya Muslims. Ahmadiyya Muslims, by the way, have the unfortunate circumstance of being the wrong kind of Muslim, which, as we've seen in Pakistan and other places, sort of is where the exclusionary politics of these groups tend to go. Jamaat-E-Islami a few months ago carried out a campaign of arson attacks targeting Hindu homes. And meanwhile, in Pakistan, Jamaat-E-Islami has been linked to groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Badr, and Hizbul Mujahideen in Kashmir. And it's played a key role in both the Afghan jihad fighting against allied forces and the Kashmir jihad. So Jamaat-E-Islami does have people that engage in politics, though. So perhaps it's not incorrect to call them a political party where they're registered as such, though they're not registered as a political party in Bangladesh. But regardless, to call Jamaat a political party is no more accurate than it would be to refer to an entire person as an arm. They are a transnational organization with an explicit agenda of replacing democracy with their vision of a theocracy. It's not about religion. It's about power. They pursue this agenda by exploiting legal and democratic processes with the intention of undermining and ultimately removing them. And they encourage, condone, justify, and support the commission of violent acts to achieve their political, ideological, and social goals. The very definition not of a political party, but of a violent extremist group.
Okay, well, before we move to Sam, I have a couple of questions that I think need addressing right
Okay.
away so that it moves the
I said a lot, so.
yeah, the discussion moves. First of all, I think you referred to 1971 and the Jamaat-E-Islami's role there, but you didn't elaborate on it. So I'd like you to do that. But before you do that, I want you to address the question of, okay, Jamaat-E-Islami, by your description, is a challenge to Bangladeshi stability, and its ideology is perhaps more so. But why is it a threat in the context of the forthcoming elections if, as you say, they're going to run for only 25 seats? The best case scenario for them would be a coalition with BNP and coming to power with that. Why should we be concerned about that? Explain that to us. I may know the answer, but I'd like you to share the answer with the audience. And then the third part of it is, what do you see or foresee as the likely outcome of the next election? In the past, Bangladeshi elections have not just been about the result in terms of who got how many votes, but in terms of other consequences. One party deciding to get out of parliament, putting people on the streets, etc. So that's another challenge to stability or another form of challenge to stability. And the Jamaat-E-Islami does have street power, I think maybe perhaps even more than BNP. The BNP may have more votes. The Jamaat has more dedicated cadres. So what are the scenarios that we need to be concerned about, if at all? And lastly, what do you say to people who say that, you know what, this Jamaat-E-Islami, quote unquote, has become the bogeyman for those who are already in power and who don't want to share power? So I want you to address that question up front before somebody in the audience asks it later on. Let's get the answer to these four questions. Start with explaining what happened in 71, then move on to the other three.
Okay. I will try to be very quick about this. As you've probably gathered, given a long leash, I will talk too much about it because I find it fascinating.
I can yank the lead.
So in 1971, Jamaat-E-Islami played an incredibly important and terrible role. Jamaat-E-Islami, and this is, it's important to understand that Jamaat-E-Islami originally, let's go back a little bit to 1947, objected to the establishment of Pakistan because Jamaat-E-Islami does not recognize nations. They're truly transnational. Now, once Pakistan was established, Jamaat-E-Islami very quickly found the role that they could play in exploiting the Islamist nature of the Pakistani ideology that was being developed. Fast forward to 1971 when Bangladesh, the Awami League had actually been elected in Pakistan. At that time, Bangladesh was East Pakistan. Now, the West Pakistanis didn't like this. They didn't like this idea that power would be held by this Bengali party from the East. It was supposed to be held in Punjab. And so the elections were essentially nullified. As negotiations broke down, the Awami League and the Bangladeshi people said, we've had enough. We want our freedom. We want to have our own country. We're our own people. The Pakistan army was hearing none of that, and they were able to recruit Jamaat-E-Islami as proxies to carry out attacks, to try to subdue the growing liberation movement in Bangladesh. And of course, this is nothing new. This is what they tried in Kashmir. When they lost Kashmir, they sent in Ghazis to try to liberate it. There's another big myth in the world is that we like to talk about how the CIA invented the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Not that the CIA or the US were innocent, but that was actually the Pakistan army. In 1971, Jamaat-E-Islami, in their proxy groups, in their militias, killed millions of innocent Bangladeshis. They particularly targeted academics who they saw as a threat to Pakistani hegemony. They raped hundreds of thousands of women. The atrocities are, and I suggest if any of you have the opportunity to visit the Liberation War Museum in Bangladesh, and you will see the evidence of these atrocities. So that's the role they played there. So why are they a threat now if they don't have this electoral power? You really got, I think, to the nut when you talked about their street power. And I'd actually like to make a comparison to something in Pakistan that happened recently. Just before the most recent Pakistani elections, Imran Khan, the head of PTI, who's now prime minister, reached out and really tried to bring into the fold a group called Tehreek-e-Laibach Pakistan. And there was clearly this idea that, yes, they were frustrating and they were a problem for the previous government, but I can control them. What happened, though, was not that. What happened was, and Tehreek-e-Laibach also participated in the elections and had very little electoral power.
But Tehreek-e-Laibach is about to be yanked. So.
Okay. They were able to shut down most of Pakistan, declaring in protest of the Supreme Court's acquittal of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman who was convicted and sentenced to death for blasphemy charges. TLP, groups like this, like Jamaat-E-Islami, their power comes not from electoral votes. They will use the democratic process however they can to get power. They don't need to become the prime minister. And the last time that Jamaat-E-Islami was able to come to power through an alliance, they had 2 federal ministers.
In Bangladesh.
In Bangladesh. There was an interesting article about by a journalist who's very critical of the Awami League, in which he said that he is by no means a foe of the BNP or Jamaat-E-Islami, but he said that he had found from high-level, credible sources that when Jamaat-E-Islami had 2 federal ministers, During that period, there was a federal minister who had been operating as a clandestine agent of the ISI, of Pakistan intelligence. Now, Pakistan intelligence has, gets blamed for a lot of things, but I think that this is noteworthy. So they don't have to have electoral powers.
Okay. And the last point, which is that maybe their threat is being exaggerated because there is a power grab
Right.
taking place in Bangladesh. So a short answer to that.
A short answer to that is that I think that there are certainly concerns about heavy-handed tactics by the present government. That's indisputable. There were similar concerns when the BNP was in power in the early 2000s. This is an unfortunate reality of politics in Bangladesh, and this doesn't mean to excuse
the party
it.
in power uses heavy-handed tactics.
That the party in power...
That is a point we all need to address at the end of this.
Yes.
That for democracy in Bangladesh, all political parties need to at least start learning to respect each other and to try and be less heavy-handed in their own conduct while dealing with extremists like the Jamaat.
Absolutely. And when we saw the return to politics of Kamal Hussein, as I was mentioning earlier, there was a lot of cautious optimism that maybe this was going to be a new chapter, that if the BNP could have an alliance, and I've written about this in the past, that if they could return to the founding principles of Bangladesh, and particularly the principle of religious freedom
And secularism.
secularism, that we could have a really robust debate about policies and what Bangladesh's place in the world could be.
Good. I'll pass the mantle to Sam Westrop now to carry on the conversation. Sam, you come to the discussion of Bangladesh not through the knowledge of Bangladesh politics, unlike Seth. You come to it through your efforts at Islamist Watch, Middle East Forum, who has partnered with us for this event today. They have been sort of trying to figure out what is the domestic impact, especially in the United States, of Islamist groups from various parts of the world. So please share with us your perspective on Bangladeshi Islamist extremist groups and their impact at home in the United States and why we should be concerned about it.
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, it's not just about the impact of Bangladeshi Islamism here in the United States, but the impact of Islamism in the United States in Bangladesh. And I think Jamaat-E-Islami is one of the more interesting Islamist networks in the world today, precisely because of the strength of its diaspora force. Now, my particular focus is charities, not just terror finance, but the spread of Islamism through charitable infrastructure, through humanitarian work. And when it comes to Bangladesh, this is a particularly interesting question. And I was very interested last year when the Bangladeshi government restricted the activities of two big, prominent charities operating in Bangladesh. One was Islamic Relief, the other one was called Muslim Aid. These are enormous charities. They also happen to be Islamist charities, lawful Islamist charities, soft Islamist charities, some call them, but they are Islamist. One was founded by, Islamic Relief was founded by SM al-Haddad, who is one of the most senior Muslim Brotherhood officials in Egypt, currently languishing in jail alongside his former boss, Mohammed Morsi. Muslim Aid, meanwhile, was set up by Jamaat-E-Islami. It was in fact set up, and one of its inaugural trustees was a man named Chowdhury Muinuddin, who is a wanted war criminal in Bangladesh. He was one of the people convicted in absentia for his role in the mass murder of people during the 1971 Liberation War. And, Islamists have always used charities to further their goals. This is nothing new. It shouldn't be surprising that we're now seeing Islamists set up charities. It's happened since the beginning. Since the 1930s, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt set up schools, orphanages. It provides social services, welfare services. It happens in Gaza with Hamas in Pakistan. Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan runs schools. It tries to provide welfare services. In fact, in Mali in 2012, Al-Qaeda started distributing low-cost prescription drugs for people temporarily under its control. And of course, the Islamic State had a very significant welfare service. And so when it comes to Bangladesh, we shouldn't be surprised to see charities play an important role, not just in the growth of Jamaat-E-Islami, but also in other forces as well. Charities can provide violent support. In 2005, the Bangladeshi government warned that a number of Western charities, which fundraise and have offices here in the US and in Britain as well, were openly supporting Salafi jihadists in Bangladesh. Charities like Green Crescent, very prominent British charity that fundraised here. It was running schools in Bangladesh that later turned out were stockpiling huge amounts of weapons. ISRA, the Islamic Relief Agency, a Sudanese charity very close to bin Laden, also funding Jamaatul Mujahideen, Bangladesh. The list goes on. There are a dozen more examples. But more interesting for us are the lawful Islamist charities, groups like Islamic Relief, like Muslim Aid, that are not stockpiling weapons, that are not funding jihad, but are helping spread the ideology of Islamism, helping groups like Jamaat-E-Islami increase their influence. And this really starts, when it comes to Bangladesh and Jamaat, after the 1971 war. Activists, or at least killers from the war, fled Bangladesh, perhaps fearing punishment for their crimes, and moved to the West. One of those was Chowdhury Muinuddin, whom I mentioned earlier. He set up Muslim Aid. The other was a man called Ashraf Zaman Khan, who moved to the US and set up a very prominent front group here, the Islamic Circle of North America, which today is one of the most important community institutions for American Muslims. So two killers from the same killing squad go to two countries on either side of the Atlantic and end up running the most important community organizations in those countries. These mass murderers went from practicing mass murder to sort of manipulating mass media. It was a switch from violent to non-violent Islamism. And it shows how adaptable Islamists are at this switch, and how they can exploit not just the bomb, but the ballot box as well. If you take Chowdhury Muinuddin, he didn't just set up Muslim Aid, he set up the Islamic Foundation, a very prominent think tank in northern England. Its directors have included Khursheed Ahmed, the vice president of Jamaat-E-Islami in Pakistan, and a notorious fan of the Taliban. He set up interfaith groups and various environmental initiatives and youth organizations in London. And the same is true here in the US. And the most interesting organizations from our perspective are the charities that emerged out of the Islamic Circle of North America, which is the main Jamaat proxy, and something that Abha, I think, a fellow speaker, will speak more on in a bit. But the charities they established are particularly interesting. And the most prominent, the foreign aid charity, is called Helping Hand for Relief and Development. And it is the overseas arm of the American Jamaat-E-Islami movement. And it is not shy about its affiliations. In Pakistan, it openly works with Lashkar-e-Taiba, openly, despite the fact that Lashkar-e-Taiba and its front groups, Jamaat-ul-Dawah and so on, are designated under US law. Helping Hand openly works with them. All the while, it enjoys occasional praise from the State Department and a number of policymakers. Helping Hand openly funds Al-Khidmat Foundation, which is Jamaat-e-Islami's charitable arm in Pakistan, but which operates very closely in Bangladesh, building schools. One wonders what they teach at these schools with that kind of support. Helping Hand is run by officials who openly identify as Jamaat-e-Islami officials, from opposing the war crimes tribunals in Bangladesh that work to bring Jamaat-e-Islami criminals to justice, to promoting Jamaat-e-Islami political propaganda from both the Bangladeshi and the Pakistani branches. So there is no doubt about this organization's affiliation. It does not try to hide it. And I think, as Seth mentioned earlier, not many people have heard of Jamaat-e-Islami, especially when you speak to policymakers or journalists. And this is partly because of a very expert PR operation, but also because people who tend not to be interested in non-violent Islamism. And that's how it exists in the West, as non-violent. Jamaat-e-Islami does not advocate killing people here, does not advocate committing acts of terror or any other form of violence. All it does is provide the theological and political justification for violence elsewhere. And that distinction is enough to have let them escape the attention of policymakers and journalists. So I think one of the more interesting points is the man who runs Helping Hand for Relief and Development, a man called Mohsin Ansari. And he's a typical Jamaati. He blames the Jews for quite a lot of things. And he openly supports, of course, a lot of the senior Jamaati war criminals who were convicted during the tribunal. He doesn't hide that. He made it clear when the tribunals were happening that ICNA the Islamic Circle of North America and the Helping Hand for Relief and Development, would be hosting funeral prayers, would be organizing funeral prayers for some of the war criminals involved in the killings. He also spoke about the victimization of Jamaat in Bangladesh and Pakistan. And this is a very common theme. And in the run-up to the election, where in Bangladesh on the 30th, and this is where non-violent Islamism becomes more interesting than violent Islamism, because this is about Islamists exploiting the ballot rather than by frightening through violent means. The current language coming out of American Jamaat-E-Islami networks is that the BNP, the current Jamaat-E-Islami alliance with the BNP, is an important and noble axis that must be maintained. And in fact, the son of Moita Rahman Nizami, one of the former leader of Jamaat-E-Islami Bangladesh, who was executed for his role in 1971 killings, his son is very active here in the US, promoting the Jamaat-E-Islami cause. He's an academic in North Carolina. And his whole argument is that his father and the founder of the BNP, Zia Rahman, who were both killed, are both martyrs, are both victims of the wicked secular agenda of the ruling Awami League. And this narrative is not just being put forward by the sons of war criminals, but by the Jamaat-E-Islami network across the US, from the local community groups from San Francisco to Chicago to the Helping Hand, drop off your clothes to give aid abroad in Bangladesh, food bank kind of places all around the country. There is a sophisticated operation, narrative being pushed among the South Asian diaspora to policymakers, to journalists about Bangladesh that makes use of this network, this Islamist network set up in the 1970s. And it's a frightening thing to see. I think the other point I would like to make is about policymakers' understanding of Jamaat. And for years, Jamaat has operated, as I mentioned earlier, because it was non-violent. It never came under too much scrutiny. Over the last few years, especially in Europe, this perspective is starting to change, I think for the better. There isn't David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister of the UK, gave a couple of very important speeches where he said that no one becomes a terrorist like that. It's not you don't go from peaceful one day to blowing up a bus or a synagogue the next. It happens because of a pattern of radicalization. You come into contact with people who introduce ideas, and those ideas get more violent and more dangerous. And Jamaat-E-Islami, very quickly, especially since the rise of ISIS, has been seen as part of that radicalization process. As I said before, they may not say, go pick up that Kalashnikov, go shoot a school, but they do provide the ultimate justification for it, at least the inkling of an idea that might lead people to think it's a valid option for young Muslims to take. And this is now being realized in European policy circles. It escaped no one's notice in London that the majority of Islamic State recruits came from areas of London under Jamaat-E-Islami control, under the control who they ran the schools, the community centres, the healthcare clinics, everything. That's partly, of course, thanks to European state multiculturalism policy, which actively deputizes communities to run their own affairs. But nonetheless, it has escaped no one's notice that Jamaat-E-Islami runs the show, and where it runs the show, terrorists emerge. Much like in Bangladesh, the South Asian Bangladeshi diaspora here in the US is split. Just as there are supporters of Islamism here who set up these groups I've mentioned, there are also earnest secular advocates of free, stable, liberal ideas. And so the battle against Islamism in Bangladesh is the same as the battle we face here, because our prospects are indelibly tied to Bangladesh's. We fight the same fight. We know both the threat of violent and non-violent Islamism. And that's why what's happening on the 30th, I think, is so important. And what happens in Bangladesh has an effect here, and what happens here has an effect there. Bangladesh should receive more of our focus. It should receive more attention. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sam, just one question. So Seth spoke about lobbying efforts here, which basically are directed at trying to kind of paint a different picture, not see anything nefarious about these groups. Have you, in your research, found any evidence of an overlap between the political lobbying effort and the charitable work? Because after all, it's the charities that have the bigger sort of, ability to raise funds, operate openly, and they're not violating the law. So they're not breaking the law, but then are they overlapping with the political effort back home or on behalf of the political organizations back home?
So a couple of good examples here. Firstly, the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, of course, is mostly active in Bangladesh, but it also runs candidates here in the United States. And in the midterms, in the midterms and in a special election before that, we had two pretty important BNP activists from Bangladesh who also live in America, running in American local elections. And they did so with the support of local Jamaat-E-Islami groups from the Islamic Circle of North America and other organizations. And I say they're BNP activists. One of them is the editor of the BNP's international magazine. So this is a serious BNP guy. And whether these people are Islamists themselves is another question, but they certainly have the support of Jamaat-E-Islami. They certainly had the support of the Islamists. As for the lobbying, we had a man, the deputy head of Jamaat-E-Islami, Abdul, a barrister in London, visited DC a few months ago to meet with policymakers and a few think tanks. His visit was acknowledged and recognized and supported by Jamaat-E-Islami activists here in DC. There is no separation between the political activities of Jamaat internationally and the charitable activities. It's all part of one network. And unlike other Islamist network. Take the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. People always talk about a Muslim Brotherhood network here in the US. I've never really bought that because it's not like they're taking orders from the Guidance Bureau, or at least there's no evidence that they're taking orders from sort of Egyptian figures in Cairo. It's more nebulous than that. I think there are groups in the US whose ideology is informed by the Muslim Brotherhood and perhaps were once activists or connected, but it's less cohesive. It's nebulous. The Jamaat-E-Islami is a different question, I think. I think it's very closely tied to leadership of Jamaat-E-Islami in Pakistan and Bangladesh.
So your argument would be that the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States has less tangible connections to the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or at least the Central Guidance Bureau of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, whereas the Jamaat-E-Islami networks in America are much more closely tied to their leaderships back in Bangladesh and possibly Pakistan?
I think absolutely that. And Muslim Brotherhood branches around the world can't even agree with each other. The number of splits. And even within Egypt, there are about 3 different strains of the Brotherhood right now. Jamaat is more cohesive.
Okay. Well, Abha, you have been working this subject quite a while. You have produced some remarkable research.
Thank you.
And we would like you to share your research with us.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So thank you, Husain. And I'm going to be talking about Jamaat-E-Islami front groups in the United States. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Islamic Circle of North America and the Muslim Ummah of North America. These are the 2 prominent Jamaat-E-Islami front groups operating in the country. And both of them have very close ties, as Sam mentioned, to the Jamaat-E-Islami, and they also have had a very long and active presence in the country. The Investigative Project on Terrorism has been monitoring ICNA's, which is the Islamic Circle of North America's, Islamist activities for well over 2 decades. And because of our investigative reporting, as well as reports by the Middle East Forum and other groups, what has happened is that groups such as ICNA and MUNA, which is the Muslim Ummah of North America, have gotten more clever at hiding their true Islamist agendas. So they've started to hide under the guise of civil rights and advocacy groups. And rather than openly calling for violent jihad or openly promoting their Jamaat-E-Islami ideology, they have started to engage in something called doublespeak. So they may say something in the public domain, and they might say something completely at variance with what they are saying publicly in private settings. ICNA has been around for some time, and it was established in 1968 and formally incorporated in 1987. It's headquartered in Jamaica, New York, and shares the same goal as the Jamaat-E-Islami. And this is pretty obvious from its charter and material that they've published earlier on their website, their numerous publications. And a pamphlet that was, for instance, published and distributed by ICNA at an event, it states the organization's goal is to establish the Islamic system in this land. Jamaat leaders have featured prominently at ICNA events, and Yusuf Islahi, who is the leader of Jamaat-E-Islami Hind, which is the Indian affiliate of Jamaat-E-Islami, he speaks regularly at ICNA conventions. Islahi is also the chief patron of ICNA's signature proselytization project, Why Islam? And he has in the past criticized the Western interest-based economic system and also blamed the Jews for the 9/11 attacks. Jamaat leaders who have taken part in past ICNA events include Qazi Hussain Ahmad, who was the former Amir of Jamaat-E-Islami Pakistan, and Abdul Khader Mullah, Ghulam Azam, who are leaders of Jamaat-E-Islami Bangladesh. And these people, they have featured as speakers at ICNA conventions. And they were also convicted for war crimes by a war crimes tribunal during war crimes they committed during Bangladesh's 1971 independence war. I'm going to talk a little bit about ICNA's Tarbiyah, which is its education, growth, development, and membership program. According to a 2010 members handbook published by ICNA's Tarbiyah department, ICNA has been described as an Islamic Jama, an organization struggling towards Iqamat ad-Din in this land. Iqamat ad-Din, as defined by ICNA, is the establishment of Islam in its totality so that He, Allah, may make it prevalent over all religions in North America. The handbook lists five stages for the eventual establishment of a global caliphate, starting with the individual, the family, the society, the state, and finally the global level, something very similar to the Muslim Brotherhood process. After the IPT published an expose detailing the handbook's radical content, it was removed from ICNA's website. Another ICNA entity is Young Muslims, and its stated goal is to train Muslim youth to be Islamic workers for the establishment of Islam in the United States. The resources page on Young Muslims' website is interestingly password protected, and we can all guess the reason why. An archived web link that includes a reading list of major works by Islamist ideologues includes the works of Maududi, Hassan al-Banna, Zakir Naik, Yusuf Qaradawi, Jamal Badawi, Shamim Siddiqui, and others. ICNA again removed this reading list after the IPT wrote an article about it. I just want to mention a little bit about Shamim Siddiqui, who passed away recently. He was the head of ICNA's Dawah and Publications Department, and he is openly a member of Jamaat-E-Islami. An obituary that ICNA published soon after his passing mentions his website, which is dawainamericas.com, and it is replete with pro-Jamaat and anti-Western propaganda. In 2001, Young Muslims hosted a jihad camp for Muslim youth aged 14 to 25 years in Pennsylvania, ostensibly to provide them with a proper understanding of the concept of jihad. A copy of the flyer that is in the possession of the IPT, it has quotes by Sayyid Qutb and Maududi, so we can only imagine, what was taught at this camp. In 2009, after 5 young men who attended an Alexandria area mosque that is affiliated to ICNA, they traveled to Pakistan to fight US forces. And after they were arrested by Pakistani authorities, ICNA issued a press release saying, "Extremism has no place in Islam, and ICNA works tirelessly to expose extremist and violent ideology." Nothing could be further from the truth. ICNA's 1997 Southeastern Regional Convention honored Jibril Abu Adam. He was an American citizen and convert to Islam, and he was killed while fighting alongside terrorists in Kashmir. Abu Adam trained with Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Kashmiri jihadist group that is believed to be behind the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks. The Message International, which is ICNA's flagship publication, has featured an interview with now designated Hizbul Mujahideen commander Sayyid Salahuddin, lauding him as a Mujahideen fighter. ICNA's former vice president and leader of its New York chapter, Ashraf Usman Khan, was tried in absentia by a Bangladeshi war crimes tribunal and sentenced to death. The tribunal claimed that Khan was chief executor of the killing squad Al-Badr, which is a militant offshoot of Jamaat-E-Islami. As soon as these allegations came to the fore, ICNA scrubbed Khan's name from its website. Former ICNA president Naeem Beg, who's now with the Dar al-Hijra Mosque in Fairfax, Virginia, has called the execution of Abdul Khader Mullah, who's a leader of Jamaat-E-Islami Bangladesh, as a political murder and a dark day of justice. Mullah was convicted on war crimes charges by the War Crimes Tribunal. He was called the Butcher of Mirpur because of the atrocities he'd committed during the 1971 war. That included beheading a poet and raping an 11-year-old girl. I will talk a little bit about the Muslim Ummah of North America, which was established in Brooklyn in 1990. In 2011, a senior Jamaat leader and financier Mir Qasim Ali and his US-based brother Mir Masoom Ali, who is a member of Muna's executive board, reportedly spent over $300,000 to hire a lobbying firm to influence American lawmakers against the War Crimes Tribunal. Qasim Ali was, however, hanged in September 2016 following his conviction on war crimes-related charges that included the abduction and killing of a teenager. In 2010, Muna organized a picnic at which Muhammad Kumar Rizman, who was Jamaat-E-Islami's Assistant Secretary General, and he was the guest of honor at this picnic. In 2013, the War Crimes Tribunal sentenced Kumar Rizman to death for his role in the murder of 120 unarmed farmers. I want to wrap up by saying that ICNA's and Muna's propagation of Jamaat-E-Islami's ideology runs contrary to secular Western values of democracy and liberty. We need to continue to expose the doublespeak and deceptive agendas of Islamists so as to isolate and marginalize them. Instead of government officials, law enforcement, interfaith groups engaging with Islamist groups such as ICNA and Muna, they need to reach out to mainstream Muslim voices that more accurately represent the interests of the American Muslim community. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So let me get started. So let's be clear about one thing. What you've pointed out is that the role of ICNA and Muna that you've pointed out as organizations is not that they are breaking the law, but that they are violating or are undermining American values. Is that a correct way of characterization so that nobody accuses us of being totally one-sided and pushing the argument?
Right. So I think with groups like ICNA, Muna, and other Islamists, they make use of our very open societies and democratic values to espouse Islamist ideas and ideology, which is very...
and you are making a distinction between Islam and Islamism.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The thing is that they propagate Islamist ideas which are very contrary to our values.
Okay.
So I don't think they are kind of, doing anything unlawful, but at the same time, what they are propagating is in a way promoting Islamist ideas and kind of feeding into the grievance narratives of, the terrorists by calling the war on terrorism as a war on Islam.
Okay. Okay, so it's more about narratives than it's
Yes.
about action. Okay, second thing that I want, you cited the War Crimes Tribunal in Bangladesh repeatedly, and just for clarity's sake, those war crimes tribunals were controversial outside of Bangladesh. There were people who thought that due process had not been taken into account, that the law was not necessarily upheld. They are not comparable to, say, for example, an international war crimes tribunal.
Right.
And it was more like basically a Bangladeshi court that was convicting. So while it was called a war crimes tribunal, it was essentially a Bangladeshi court and not comparable to an international war crimes tribunal.
Right. So there were concerns raised about the procedure, the process in which these war crimes proceedings were conducted, and Amnesty International and other groups kind of came out criticizing, the way the process was conducted. But at the same time, when this tribunal was instituted, it got the support of the international community, the International Crimes Tribunal at The Hague, and Amnesty International did kind of support the establishment of the War Crimes Tribunal. But the thing was that I think the issue was more with the procedure, the way it was, the style in which it was conducted, because there was a lot of testimony that came out of the trials, which was very compelling. You had a very kind of heart-rending, images that people kind of recalled from their own, witness of.
And had the tribunals been created right after 1971, in 72, 73, 74, perhaps the evidence would have been easier to obtain. Perhaps there would have been a more neutral process under international supervision, and because that wasn't done, partly because of the 1974 or 75 coup that brought General Ziaur Rahman to power, that whole process kind of stopped in its tracks, and that's why that happened. So it's important. The context is important. Okay, I think we've got a lot of a lot to chew on. Not necessarily something that everybody agrees with, and so I'm sure that there are going to be some questions, interesting and tough ones. Anyone I know I can see several of my Bangladeshi friends raising their hands, but I'll give the questions to non-Bangladeshis first, just to get the discussion going. Yep.
Jack Pagano, COO of a major television radio station network in Afghanistan. And as you know, Afghanistan is a very dangerous place every day. The information I'd like to throw this out to anyone on the panel, the refugees, 700,000 refugees, we have not talked about this. A breeding ground for ISIS, a breeding ground.
700,000 refugees from where to where?
From Myanmar into Bangladesh.
From Myanmar to Bangladesh, okay, the Rohingyas.
And they're there and they have no place to go. It is a breeding ground. We are watching this because we don't want this to happen in Afghanistan. Question, what is happening? How do we have a solution? Bangladesh, unfortunately, is out of sight, out of mind. It's out of sight, out of mind. It's called fatigue, donor fatigue. How do we get over that?
Anyone want to take that? Seth?
I'll take something real quick. I don't know that I have a good solution. I don't know that anybody has a good solution. I do think that, I will say a couple of things. One is that Bangladesh has been a real leader in taking in the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. For anybody who's not familiar, these are Muslims in Myanmar who were really experiencing and facing a genocide of their own by the state in Myanmar and fled into Bangladesh. They have been living in camps. It is, I think it is one of the great human rights catastrophes in the world today that almost nobody knows about. The Bangladesh needs more support from the United States and from the world community in resolving this situation, because it's not going to be easy. The second thing that I'll say, I have not personally visited the Rohingya camps, but friends of mine with government agencies here in the United States have. And the first, when they came back, I asked them, give me a debrief. What are you seeing? Because I had these very fears. As Sam and Abha have discussed, charity groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba in particular, has the Fali Insyat Foundation, which they use to infiltrate into disaster areas to recruit and proselytize. Again, I was surprised, but pleasantly so, when everyone reported. You would be shocked how little the Islamist groups have been able to infiltrate into the Rohingya camps. This is one area where, and the government of Bangladesh gets a lot of criticism, sometimes deservedly so. This is one area where the government of Bangladesh, in vetting the relief groups that have been allowed in, have done an extraordinary job of presenting that so far. Now, how long that bulwark can last, I don't know, but I agree with you completely. Something has to be done.
Other questions? Yes. Right behind you. I'll come to you later.
Thank you. My name is Alex Ellis. I work for BGR Group. I'm interested in hearing kind of each of your responses to these questions, and I'm going to package them into one. Does the alliance between BNP and Jamaat worry you? And what can we expect in terms of violence in the upcoming elections from the BNP and Jamaat alliance?
So I'll start off there. I mean, does the BNP Jamaat alliance worry me? I mean, I don't know that it worries me because it's been around for a long time. I think I was, as I said before, I was cautiously optimistic when Kamal Hussein returned to the situation that there could be a change, that the BNP could see that it had an alternative other than making an alliance with a radical Islamist group. My optimism meter is sort of going down. As far as violence related to the elections that are coming up, again, this is another area where I don't know, maybe I just have a sunny disposition, but I had some cautious optimism because we weren't seeing the types of pre-election violence that we had especially in 2013, 2014, but the election before that as well. Unfortunately, in the past week, as the elections draw closer, we are starting to see more violence break out. In the past week, there have been a number of incidents. Now, one thing I want to quickly do is I want to separate what political violence in Bangladesh is into two buckets, because there's really two sort of spaces that violence takes place. One is violence, inter-party violence, that is really kind of like gangland warfare, where you have supporters of one party go out and they carry out an attack against supporters of another party, and then they retaliate, and there's this street level gangland type violence carried out by supporters of the political parties. And it tends to be kept, like gangland violence, really within the political workers. They know what they're signing up for. That's not to justify it, but that's part of it. At Liberty South Asia, one of the things that we have been really worried about was what we saw a lot of, especially in 2014, and I talked a little bit about this, is the attacks against religious minorities, particularly carried out by Jamaat-E-Islami, with the purpose of suppressing the vote of religious minorities in Bangladesh, Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, because these communities tend to vote for secular politicians. And as long as the Jamaat-E-Islami has an alliance with the BNP, then a lot of these religious minorities are concerned about whether or not the BNP can represent their interests in power. So they tend to vote for the Awami League. The Jamaat-E-Islami wants to stop them from voting. We have not so far seen a lot of the volume of attacks against religious minorities in election-related violence. But like I said, we've only started in the past couple of weeks to see violence start to take place. So, my cautious optimism meter again is it's wavering.
Sam, Abha, do you have any comments on this point?
Yeah, just the one. I mean, any alliance with Jamaat worries me. So it's not the BNP in particular that worries me as a Jamaat partner. It's that anyone would assume Jamaat makes a suitable partner given its long history of violence and the fact it is a theocratic organization. I will say, I think it's important to note, however, that while there are certainly factions within the BNP who do not warmly endorse this cozying up to the Islamists, the BNP's behavior has been enough for Western governments to speak out in concern. And a few years ago, I think during an immigration case, the Department for Homeland Security did argue at one point in a court case, which they ultimately lost, that the BNP was effectively a terrorist organization because of its involvement with more violent Islamist types. And I believe under Trudeau, the Canadian government made an even stronger statement at one point. So for the BNP's own sake, they can see what hanging around with these jihadists and Islamists does to their reputation.
Can I add one thing real quick?
Sorry,
Just want to add one thing to what Sam said, because and this has been something that's really interesting. There have been public reports in the Bangladeshi media about schisms within the BNP over this issue of the Jamaat alliance. There are a number of BNP officials who have said this is a cinder block we've tied around our neck, and we have to get rid of this. And if we get rid of this, we're going to be able to make a credible and legitimate and more successful opposition to the Awami League. Unfortunately, for whatever internal reasons, they have not, that faction within the BNP has not won out. So even within the BNP, there's disagreement.
Okay, so you wanted to go forward. Well, I'll come to you next.
Thank you, sir. And thanks to the Hudson to organize such an important discussion on Bangladesh. So the title is Stability, Democracy and Islamism in
Could you
Bangladesh.
introduce yourself first?
sir.
Could you stand up, please? Thank you.
Kausar Mumin, I'm a journalist. I report for a national daily newspaper from New York. The title of today's discussion is Stability, Democracy and Islamism in Bangladesh. So I see the word stability after and the democracy is after. So is it, this question is to Sir Haqqani. So is it something like that you giving importance to stability in Bangladesh and you want the democracy to see democracy later? Or is it, because we have seen for the last 10 years silencing stability in Bangladesh, but that have hurt our democratic process very largely. So, so which one you prefer, the stability first or democracy first? This is my one question. And the second part of this is Islamism in Bangladesh. You see, from my experience, it is, I must say that because of lack of democratic process in Bangladesh for the last 10 years, in this year's election, 70 Islamist parties are taking part in election. 10 of them are registered parties, and both the alliance, Awami League has 5, BNP has got 5. But total 70 Islamic parties taking election this coming election. But when you are discussing about Islamism, your discussion is only focusing on one party. But do you have any concern that the participation of Islamic parties in Bangladesh election has got increased a total of 10% than before the previous election?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take your first comment, first remark as only a comment. It could have been very easily, if it had been Islamism, democracy and stability, you would have said, why is Islamism first? If we had put democracy first, and so it's only a choice of words. You're if you are a journalist, you know you put words wherever you put at any particular moment. I think we would like Bangladesh to be democratic. We want Bangladesh to be stable. We want Bangladesh to be economically prosperous. And we want Bangladeshis to be able to argue with one another without hopefully killing one another. So all of that is our hope for Bangladesh. As far as the second question is concerned, does anyone have a comment on that, the multiplication of the number of Islamic political parties in Bangladesh?
So I'll say two quick things. One is I think it's important to separate out the difference between an Islamist party and an Islamic party. This sounds like maybe splitting hairs, but it's actually really important because a political party or an organization can be, based in Islamic values, right? But it can be democratic in nature. It can be pluralistic in nature. Jamaat-E-Islami, what we've sort of focused on here, is an Islamist party. And as we saw from the words of Maulana Maududi himself, he doesn't even see Islam as a religion. He sees it as a means to gain power, and absolute power. So I think that we have to be a little bit careful when we're trying to distinguish between these parties. And then as far as the 10% electoral power, again, I think that this is something that is really important, and I think that sometimes we get a little bit too hung up on it, on this, but they can't get the votes. So do they really matter? Is this a fringe sort of thing? And the case study that I would point to, again, is in Pakistan. In Pakistan, Jamaat-E-Islami and Tehreek-e-Laibach Pakistan, Milli Muslim Pakistan, you have a number of very virulent Islamist theocratic parties. They can't get elected. Getting elected has much more to do with being able to deliver services. It has much more to do with being able to get people into school, to get people jobs. The power from these Islamist groups comes really from the streets and from their networks of charitable organizations.
And also perhaps that from the discourse they engender in society, the debate they can create.
Because it gives them legitimacy. This is why they participate in politics. They know that they're not going to become prime minister. In fact, I really believe that most of these groups, it would be losing for them to actually win, because now you're responsible for everything, right? They get more power from being in the opposition. They get legitimacy from participating in the process, even though ultimately they want to get rid of it. And they get cover in foreign capitals by saying, no, we're not a radical group. We are just a small political party.
They influence policy more than they can actually wield.
Exactly.
And we see that religiously oriented and theocratically oriented groups in other traditions also. We see that in Israel. We see that some would argue we see that here. Groups that sort of want to influence, and they don't want office for themselves. Right. They want to operate within the political framework. As far as the multiplication of religiously based political groups is concerned, that's a phenomenon almost everywhere. So, when I was a young boy, Jamaat-E-Islami was the one major Islamic political party, Islamic and Islamist, the only political party in Pakistan. Now there's dozens, and it's the same happening in Bangladesh. I don't think that is necessarily a offshoot of any particular political decision by any particular political party or leader. But your point about Bangladesh the concerns about authoritarian tendencies in Bangladesh and anywhere else in South Asia, I think those are shared by everybody on this panel as well. Yes, sir. Tom, do you mind taking the microphone? Do you mind taking the microphone?
Tom Timberg, consultant. I wondered if you could give me us a little bit more detail on what's happening with the Ghana Forum as a political phenomenon. These are just basically information questions.
Sure.
And then there were two other things in Bangladesh. This is details of Bangladesh politics. There were a lot of criticisms of the Awami League because of its, if you will, concessions to Islamicist influences, suppress various people who become refugees because they were felt to be not orthodox enough, and so they fled to India, etc. To what extent, what will the impact of all of this be on that factor? And the third one is, if you talk about precisely the kinds of violent politics which has been so influenced Israel here, there is the Jamaat-E-Islami, but there are also a number of leading, the only way I describe them is extremist peers. There are other peers who are actually not so extremist. The one I keep thinking of is Pierre Sarsena down in the Southwest, who have large networks and in fact mobilize a lot of the people who come out when we say the Jamaat-E-Islami is getting people to come out. And how are they relating to this particular phenomenon? And then I also, this is just curiosity. In the United States,
they could go on forever. You do realize.
No, right, I understand. But this is in the United States, I'm conscious of some of this politics acting out in terms of local level mosque politics, more in Baltimore than in this area. And I wondered if you could say anything about this.
Okay. So what we're going to do is, since we only have 7 more minutes left for the event, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions together, then the panel can answer them, and then we can move on. This gentleman has had his hand up for a while, right here in the front. Make your question short so that we can have a good, sharp answer.
My identity is I'm Bangladesh daily newspaper, Khamar Barta. I'm senior journalist from Dhaka. And another also representative in...
I'm sure you have a name as well.
Yeah.
Can you have your name?
Yeah, Harun Chaudhary.
Okay.
Know this. I've got a lot of talk. I have one question is this. Is Jamaat-E-Islam with BNP, they're doing the election, the 22 seat they got from BNP. And that Dr. Kamal Hossain will involved with them. People's opinion is this. And you saw this yesterday, 2 young people died, Awami League supporter there. There's a panic in Bangladesh in the people. And if they win with Jamaat-E-Islam, what will be the next? Then I heard that lots of people say, thousands people in one night they will kill. So what is sham? I need your answer from you.
Okay, thank you. Third question, and then we will have answers to all 3 together. And I'm sorry for everybody else because we will run out of time after that. So, yeah.
Thank you. Bob Riley, Westminster Institute. I wrote a study of the Catholic-Muslim dialogue in the United States as conducted by the regional U.S. bishops' conferences over a period of 10 years. And what one discovers is that often it is the Islamist groups of which you have been speaking that dominate the Muslim side of the dialogue and crowd out the other Muslims with whom one could have a real dialogue. This creates certain dangers. Have you looked at this problem of how Islamist groups have been able to monopolize the Muslim side of these interfaith dialogues? Thanks.
Good. Okay, we've got 3 very good questions. So let's go through the panel in reverse order now. Abha, which of the questions would you like to answer? And go ahead.
So I can respond to Bob's question. Bob, I didn't get your last name.
Riley.
Riley. You're right. A lot of these Islamist groups, they have made inroads into the top echelons of power, and they have increasingly gotten more legitimized, and they've gained credibility. Also, when government officials or law enforcement or interfaith groups reach out to these Islamist groups, and there's a reason for that because the Islamist groups are better organized than mainstream American Muslim voices. And that has to do because they have had a presence over many decades. And when they first came to the United States, it was the Islamists who set up the organizations because they had the experience, they had a history of organizing.
And because of the Cold War, there was no there was a general tendency to assume that they were allies rather than potential rivals.
Correct. So they were just better at organizing, and they kind of took over as the spokespeople for the American Muslim community. So now I think it is very important that government officials and interfaith groups reach out to mainstream Muslim voices. And I think there's a need to cultivate these voices.
And the mainstream Muslims also need to organize themselves
Absolutely.
better if they can.
But there is an effort that has to be made from both sides in this endeavor.
Absolutely. Sam, which of the 3 questions? In fact, there were 4 questions from Tom. So therefore, they were all curiosity questions.
I'll try and mix a few
mix
together.
them all up.
I agree very much with what Abha just said. I would also point out that Sunni Islam is very diverse. It's not just It's not just Sunni and Shia. It's not even
As
just...
the only Sunni Muslim on the panel, I can agree. Yeah.
Thank you. It's not even just Islam and Islamists, but dozens of Sufi orders and ethnic groups and cultural groups. Therefore, the idea that any one group can represent American Muslims or global Muslims or any geographic area of Muslims is preposterous. They can't. But Sunni Islam also lacks a clerical hierarchy. There's no natural religious leadership for Muslims, and there's no political leadership in the wake of all this internecine theological, not enmity necessarily, but rivalry and disagreement. So, of course, Islamists, as political animals, are best prepared to fill that void, to jump into that vacuum. They are also helped, of course, by the enormous amounts of taxpayers' money they acquire to legitimize their leadership of Western Islam. And this is something I meant to mention earlier, but just as an example, ICNA, the Islamic Circle of North America, $10 million from the US taxpayer just over the last 2 years for hurricane relief help. I've no doubt this money went to hurricane relief purposes, but the legitimacy it affords these Islamist organizations, this amount of money is enormous. $1.5 million to Muslim Aid, $80 million from Western governments to Islamic relief over the last 10 years. It goes on and on. It's a mix of money and exploiting a political vacuum within the Muslim community. The mosque thing, very quickly, I come across this all the time. This battle between Islamists and Islam, between Jamaats and secularism, plays out in American mosques every week, every day. And I'm in touch with at least 3 imams who have been, or at least former imams who have been kicked out of their mosques by Jamaat-E-Islami trustees who first, they bring the money, then they take over the trustee board, then they get rid of the imam. This happens all over the country, mosque by mosque. Yeah.
Okay. Seth, you've got quite a few questions to answer right now.
I'll be very quick. Ghana Forum, I think, is going to be the heartbreaking story of the election as it's turning out. Kamal Hussein is an octogenarian. He said he has no interest in holding office himself. I have no reason to believe that he has anything but the best interests of the country at heart.
There were those who thought he could be the Mahathir Mohamad
right.
Awami League, but I don't think that's panning out by your reports.
And he, as I said, when he announced this plan to form the Oike Front with Ghana Forum, he said the one condition is that Jamaat-E-Islami and other radical groups cannot be involved.
He has a history of being a principled,
absolutely, yes,
constitutional lawyer,
and it
long
hasn't,
history.
Right, and it hasn't worked out that way. And he was actually asked in an interview recently, but now we're looking at a situation where Ghana Forum candidates and Jamaat-E-Islami leaders are going to be sharing the same election symbol on the ballot. What do you think about that? And you could see in his answer, he said, I didn't anticipate that, and I've got to think about it and come back to you. So I think that is going to be the heartbreak of the election. As far as the Awami League concession to Islamist groups, absolutely. The Awami League, I fear, is playing a very dangerous game. It's a game that's been played over and over, not just in Bangladesh and Pakistan, in a lot of places where there is this idea that we're going to be able to outwit them. We're going to beat them at their own game. I will say, I hope it works this time. I can't remember when it's worked before. And then as far as, and then I just close on the question of the elections and like what happens if, I think the question was if the BNP Jamaat wins, is there going to be violence in retribution? And I think this is an important point when we talk about, as we've tried to acknowledge the concerns about heavy-handedness and authoritarianism, I suspect that there probably would be. And the reason is, if you go back and you read State Department human rights reports, Human Rights Watch reports, Amnesty International reports from when the Awami League was in opposition, they read exactly like their reports today, but they've just switched the parties, right? So again, this gets back to the type of inter-party violence that's carried out is an unfortunate but constant part of the political culture, and that's something where I think the U.S. needs to play a stronger role, not in alienating and taking sides, but in emphasizing the importance of negotiating and doing peaceful politics.
Well, some of the curiosity questions could not be answered, but I think we more or less covered the waterfront. Let me just end by saying that I think everybody on this panel will agree with me. We wish the people of Bangladesh well. We would like them to have a free, fair, and credible election. And we would like to see that whoever wins that election is able to provide Bangladesh stability and continued democracy while also keeping in check the theocratic tendencies that threaten Bangladesh and its secular, historically secular traditions. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to the panel.
Thank you. That was fun.
Yeah.
Good job, you.
We try and do what we can.
Seth's far too knowledgeable.
Oh, great. Hey, and thank you so much for bringing up the. You know, it's